Good evening. For those of you that I have not met, my name is Joanne Drake, and I am the Chief Administrative Officer for the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute. It is our tradition here to ask you to stand and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Be seated. It is our tradition here to honor those who serve this country in uniform, both on our continent and abroad, with that pledge, and we are grateful that you all acknowledge that. I want to thank you and welcome you here to the Reagan Library this evening. In addition to our speaker tonight, we do have a couple of special guests that I would like to introduce. First, of course, Michael Reagan, the son of our great president. Thank you, Michael, for coming. And we are very thrilled this evening to welcome 3 of Paul's 8 children. We have Paul, Mitch, and Amanda Kengor here with us this evening. Paul Kengor has become quite a regular visitor to the Reagan Library and a good friend. The last time I think we heard from Paul was in a public setting, was in 2005 in the summer when he was here after publishing God and Ronald Reagan. The book has done very well. We've sold almost 2,400 copies just in our store here. I suppose when you have 2 headliners like God and Ronald Reagan on the cover, you can count on it to be popular. Well, I believe Paul's new book has also been very well received. He spent days and weeks, and yes, months in our research room going through boxes and boxes of files. He spent days and weeks in an old barn on the Central Coast going through Bill Clark's files. I think he spent more than his fair share of time trying to get documents declassified so as to understand the real extent and the true depth of the relationship between the leader of the free world and the leader of hundreds of millions of Catholics around the world. Back in February of this year, Paul Kengor sent me an email saying that at long last, I have finished the magnum opus on Ronald Reagan and Pope John Paul II. And I'm wondering, is it possible to set up a presentation and book signing at the Reagan Library this August when I'm coming through California? And here we are. The book is not just the chronicle of 2 world leaders who worked together to bring freedom and democracy to those who were caught in the grip of Soviet communism, although it certainly is that. But it's the best account to date of a remarkable friendship between 2 men who had more in common than either of them even knew. Despite their differences in their chosen religions, they had a spiritual connection unlike no other. Working together, they really did defeat evil, and in doing so, they changed the world. Paul Kengor has weaved together stories of public and clandestine meetings, on the record and off the record accounts of those in the know, and a remarkable number of documents that, when pulled together and analyzed, weave together the history of 2 men, the people that knew them, and the individuals they helped to free. Paul will give us a brief overview of that history tonight, and then has agreed to take questions, so I want you to be thinking about that. And if he doesn't address it in his remarks, I hope you will ask him what the code word cappuccino refers to in the covert world of 2 senior advisors in the Reagan White House. As most of you know, Paul is a professor at Grove City College in Pennsylvania, and quite appropriately, the executive director of the college's Center for Vision and Values, and that describes Paul to a T. He's also a best-selling author of over a dozen books, I believe, and he's a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution right up the road at Stanford. Most importantly, he has become an expert on Ronald Reagan. And to that end, I hope you will join me in welcoming Dr. Paul Kengor to discuss his newest book, A Pope and a President, John Paul II, Ronald Reagan, and the Extraordinary Untold Story of the 20th Century.
Thank you, Joanne. So nice. Thank you, Joanne. That was too kind, and you all have been too kind to me. I don't deserve this. It's they've really rolled out the carpet for me here, and I'm humbled to be here. I'm humbled by Mike Reagan deciding to come and hear me speak as well. So, I dedicate the book to Bill Clark. I probably could have dedicated it to Mike and Joanne Drake with all they helped me with. Joanne, anytime I had a question for Mrs. Reagan, asking her things that I'm sure no one asked her before. Like, did your husband ever meet Fulton Sheen? Right? Questions like that. And Joanne would take the question to Mrs. Reagan, and I'd get an answer back that afternoon. It was really amazing. I'll hold you in suspense on that one. The short answer is no. All right, no, they decide. I don't want to tease you with that. But so thank you very much. Kirby Hansen as well, just wonderful. John for his leadership here. Melissa Giller, who's been just terrific and tying together all the ends and getting all of this together. And I should add here too, the archival staff, the archivists, who I've probably driven crazy over the years with all my different requests. I started filing FOIA requests, Freedom of Information Act requests for this book back in 2000, 2001. So this has been going on for quite a while. And finally too, I should thank David Kirk. David, are you here? I don't know if he's here or not. I don't think so. Grove City College student of mine who graduated in May, and Grove City College is a long way away from here, right? About an hour north of Pittsburgh. Well, David is from Simi Valley, and he was a docent for the Reagan Library. He put together this PowerPoint presentation. So, the guy is multi-talented, really is. I couldn't put together a PowerPoint presentation. So this is, so my thanks to David as well. All right, so as it says here, where do you start a story in a 600-page book about two of the most remarkable men of the last 100 years? Right? You started with their births in Ronald Reagan, February 1911, John Paul II, 1920. Started maybe in 1917. We get some big centenary dates here, right? May 13th, 1917. Fatima, Bolshevik Revolution, October 1917. Maybe Ronald Reagan as a lifeguard at the Rock River. Perhaps Karol Wojtyła, who was the only Catholic boy on the Jewish boys soccer team growing up in Poland. Just a lovely childhood that he had, and what the hell that he had to go through in watching so many of his friends be killed. His first girlfriend was a Jewish girl named Ginka Beer. And so to see so many of his friends be murdered by the Nazis, and then so many of his fellow priests be murdered. I mean, Ronald Reagan fought fascism and then communism in Hollywood. And he would tell you, those are some battles. He said in the 1980s, I still have scars on my back from fighting the communists in Hollywood. But his life was never quite threatened in the way that John Paul II, Karol Wojtyła, and his friends were. So it started with maybe their mothers, the deaths of their fathers, just weeks apart, months apart, in February and May 1941. Well, let's start it on October 16th, 1978. Click. Wait, maybe I got it upside down. Let me see. Yeah, where's the computer? Am I doing it wrong? I could be. Try now. As the audience waits in amazing anticipation. Don't worry if it won't work, I got it memorized. Just hit reset, right? Sometimes if you just say next. Next. Don't worry, I'm patient. I wrote a 600-page book over 20 years. I could stand here all night and do this. It'll happen, I promise you. Yeah.
Where's the picture from?
Yeah, that picture is. Yeah, I think that one's in Florida. Now the picture on the cover of the book is in Miami in September 1987 when they met there. And there was, initially the publisher wanted to have that picture on the book. There we go. Okay.
Back and forth on those two.
Which one?
On the arrows.
So,
The two arrows.
so I'll hit this one next when I want to go for it. Okay. Okay. All right, so October 16th, 1978, after a 6-decade war on religion, that's what Mikhail Gorbachev called it, in the Soviet Union, by Vladimir Lenin, the communists, Karl Marx had called religion the opiate of the masses. Lenin referred to the abominable, he said, there is nothing more abominable than religion, said Lenin. All worship of a divinity is a necrophilia. I mean, imagine that. I mean, the view that these guys had of religious faith was beyond horrible. I mean, you can't find any American founding father or president anywhere along the line that ever spoke even one time about religion the way that Marx did, the way that Lenin did, the way that Stalin did. So after 6 decades of this, suddenly the conclave meets at Rome in the Sistine Chapel, and they meet to pick a new pope. By the way, the previous pope, John Paul I, it turns out, had been pope only for 33 days. And he even said, when asked the name he picked, he said, John Paul I. They said, well, you can't have a first until you've had a second. And he said, he will come soon enough. He was sitting ahead of me in the conclave. It was as if he knew. He was pope for only 33 days. But now on October 16th, 1978, they picked their first non-Italian pope in 455 years. I mean, imagine that. First Slavic pope ever. And first one, obviously, from the communist bloc, right smack from the center of the communist bloc. And Poland, the only country in all of the communist empire, in all of the Soviet empire, where the war on religion had utterly failed. But imagine, I mean, nothing but Italian popes for 455 years. Think about how long that is. It's twice the length of the life of the United States. I mean, it was always the Pope is Italian, right? Suddenly, it's changed. They picked Karol Wojtyła, Archbishop of Krakow, 264th heir to the chair of St. Peter. There you go. Reaction to the papal selection. Poles were ecstatic. They couldn't believe it. They literally couldn't believe it. People crying, dumbfounded. Could this be? Could this be possible? Could this be possible? The one truly faithful country in all of Europe where the war on religion had failed, where 90% of the country believed in God and were professing Roman Catholics. They couldn't believe it. Could this happen? Krzysztof Meissner, who was a Polish physicist, said that they watched the evening news, and basically the communist version of Dan Rather came on. They had like one television station, that was it. It was communist-controlled media. And he said, Meissner said, he came on with a very sad face. A new pope had been elected. It was Cardinal Wojtyła. Ho-hum, right? That was it, nothing else. Time to announce the latest harvest figures, the potato crop. That was it. Absolutely amazing. So they were clearly downplaying it. They clearly had been told to downplay it. The reaction in Moscow, 3 sentences by TASS, the official Soviet news agency, and Pravda, which was the main publication of the Soviet Union. New head of the Catholic Church, Rome, October 16th. The election of the new head of the Roman Catholic Church was announced here. He's Polish cardinal, right? Krakow, Cardinal Wojtyła. He took the name of John Paul II. That was it. It's the only thing you could find in Soviet media. So that's the public reaction. The private reaction, Yuri Andropov, who had been the longest-serving head of the KGB, immediately telephoned the KGB chief in Warsaw, and he asked him, how could you allow the election of a Pole as pope, right? As somebody from a bishop from a socialist country as pope. How could you allow this to happen? And in response, the chief told Andropov, he said, you should direct your question to officials in Rome, sir, right? Rather than here. But he was furious. Andropov was furious. More on him later. Wojtyła's reaction, he turned to Father Stanislav Dziwisz and uttered the Italian phrase, li possino. What have they done? Do they realize what they've done here? They must be crazy to pick me. A Polish pope? First Slavic pope? Moscow wondered the same, and especially after the Pope's first homily, October 22nd, 1978. This is one of his most famous. He said to the faithful, be not afraid. Bill Clark used to tell me, he said that that's probably the most common phrase in all the New Testament. again and again and again and again and again. Jesus telling the disciples, be not afraid, be not afraid. Transfiguration, be not afraid. Angel Gabriel saying to Mary, be not afraid, right? Be not afraid. Open the doors to Christ, open them wide, open the borders of states, economic and political systems to the vast domains of culture. People weren't saying that at that particular time, except former governor named Ronald Reagan was saying things like that. But that was an amazing thing to say. And Moscow was very afraid. Leonid Brezhnev, who was the head of the Soviet Union, the new pope announced that his first foreign visit was going to be to Poland. And this is what I love about these two figures, John Paul II and Ronald Reagan. Courage, right? They immediately said, you can't go to Poland. The communists are going to flip out. You're not allowed to do this. He said, no, I'm going to Poland. That's my native land. My first visit is going to be to Poland. You can't do that. No pope has visited a communist country. Yeah, but I'm from a communist country. I'm going to Poland. Brezhnev, we now have the transcript from this communication. He called Edward Gierek and he said, he told him to veto this, tell him he's not coming. Gierek said, how can I not receive a Polish pope? This wasn't actually him speaking on the phone at that exact moment. But we found this picture of Brezhnev on the internet with his shirt off talking on the phone, and I had to use it. I mean, it's just absolutely magnificent. I mean, if you can't make fun of a communist dictator, who can you make fun of? But so he told Gierek, tell the Pope, he's a wise man, right? Tell him to say he's sick, he's come down with a cold and he can't make the trip, right? Just imagine that. Only in like a communist dictatorship, like, Kim's North Korea, can you get away with coming up with an excuse like that? Presumably that would be his excuse for the next 26 years. I'm still not feeling well. I can't come to Poland. So Gierek gently tried to tell him, I got to let him come. And Brezhnev slammed down the phone and said, Gomulka was a better communist than you. And that was it. He was going to Poland. So he went June 2nd to 11th, 1979, 9 days. 9 days that changed the world. Look at that crowd. You imagine an outdoor mass, any of you who are Catholic, lining up 1 million people for communion, right? One after another. Lech Walesa said in response to this, the new pope comes to Poland, and suddenly the 20 who followed me were 10 million. It's a greater multiplication than the loaves and the fishes. And it's really true. I mean, that many people started following. His opening homily, June 2nd, he chose Warsaw's Victory Square. Isn't that perfect? I mean, that's courage, again. Here's symbolic importance. I'm going to give my first talk in Victory Square. How's that for prophetic, right? Victory. The communist secret police all over the place, and then he made this statement. Christ cannot be kept out of the history of man in any part of the globe. The exclusion of Christ from the history of man is an act against man. And this is so true. Without Christ, it is impossible to understand the history of Poland. And then this statement. There can be no just Europe without the independence of Poland on its map. And that really set Moscow. That was a shot heard around the world, right there. In response to this, the New York Times, I like to make fun of the New York Times any chance that I get. So they wrote this really snooty editorial 3 days later. As much as the visit of John Paul II to Poland maybe might reinvigorate, re-inspire the Roman Catholic Church in Poland, it doesn't threaten the political order of the nation or of Eastern Europe. Yeah, right. Tell that to the Kremlin, right? Ronald Reagan's reaction. This is, George Weigel in his book, Witness to Hope, said the only person who really got this was Alexander Solzhenitsyn. And I talked to Weigel about this a few years ago. I said, no. Ronald Reagan got it too. Oh. He said, yeah, tell me about that. I said, well, you'll read the book someday. But Ronald Reagan, who at that point, in 1979, he was a former governor of California. He had lost his 76 bid for the Republican nomination for the presidency against Gerald Ford. Dick Allen, Richard V. Allen, who became the first national security advisor, first head of the NSC before Bill Clark in all of 1981. Allen told me about this. He said, I was at Ronald Reagan's home. We were talking foreign policy. We took a break. We turned on the evening news. And in those days, folks, right, evening news, there was like 1, 2, 3 channels. That was it. And we watched footage of the Pope's visit to Poland. And I looked over, and Ronald Reagan had tears in his eyes. And he said, that's it, that's it, that's it. The Pope is the key, the Pope is the key, the Pope is the key. He said, Dick, we got to get elected, and we got to reach out to him and the Vatican and make them an ally. Realized then and there how important this was. Ronald Reagan had a daily nationally syndicated radio broadcast at that time. He went right down into the studio and he did 3 or 4 different broadcasts just on the Pope's visit to Poland. These were written in his own longhand. Kyron Skinner found him here, right at the Reagan Library, published them in Reagan in his own hand a few years ago. And he said in one of these that Stalin once contemptuously asked, how many divisions does the Pope have, right? And Ronald Reagan said, well, now we just got an answer. Wherever he went in Poland, massive crowds, 400,000, 500,000, 1 million, 5 million people. And I love this line. Poles lived under first the Nazis and then the Soviets. The voices behind those tanks and guns told them there is no God. Will the Kremlin ever be the same again? The answer is no. Will any of us, for that matter, ever be the same again? And Ronald Reagan was never the same again. This was a game changer. The linchpin, Bill Clark, who would become the second national security advisor following Dick Allen. Clark started January 1st, 1982. So he was there all of 82, 83. He's the guy with Ronald Reagan who really laid out the plan, all the NSDDs, National Security Decision Directives, to win the Cold War. Clark said, Ronald Reagan knew that Poland would be the linchpin of the Soviet Empire. So now all he had to do was win the presidency, and all the new Pope had to do was survive. It's not an easy thing when you got the Soviet Union literally gunning for you. This document was declassified about 10 or 12 years ago. John Kohler, the Cold War historian and journalist, published it first around 2005. It's a November 13th, 1979 document. 9 members of the Central Committee in Moscow. One of them, by the way, is Mikhail Gorbachev, who would later say this was not what he said. I did not see it this way. So Gorbachev, disassociated himself from this interpretation. But nonetheless, the document said, use all possibilities available to the Soviet Union. That's a scary statement, Mike, right? The Soviet Union says, I'll use all possibilities available. And this is a country that killed 60 million people, all right? Use all possibilities available to prevent new course of policies initiated by the Polish Pope, if necessary with additional measures beyond disinformation and discreditation. John Kohler put it this way, in layman's terms, this was an order for assassination, foreshadowed by the need to, quote, get physically close with the Pope. And it wasn't to kiss his ring, believe me, all right? Kohler said that at the end of the text, there was this note from Italy's Secret Service, SISDA. SISDA says document found in Moscow points to plan for the physical elimination of JP2. Right? They wouldn't do that, would they? Wouldn't kill a pope. They wouldn't do that. I mean, come on. All Ronald Reagan had to do was get elected. You could applaud if you want here. This is pretty, right? I mean, where are we with the Reagan Library? I mean, this is pretty amazing. I don't know if you ever see that again. That is just stunning. I mean, that is a sea of red. 44 of 50 states against an incumbent. 51 to 41%. Took the Electoral College 489 to 49. By the way, if you think that's impressive, you ever see the map for 84? How many states did he win in 84? 49. The Electoral College count in 84 was 525 to 13. No need to recount Florida in that one, right? I mean, it's just amazing. January 20th, 1981, Ronald Reagan is inaugurated, pledges an era of national renewal. He's sworn in by Chief Justice Berger with Mike's grandmother's Bible, Nellie Reagan. And it's open to, Joanne, I think this might be on display here, the Bible, right? Right around the corner. Fabulous. Wow. I can't say that usually when I speak. I think the Bible's right around the corner here. Here it is. It was open to, so that Bible is Nell's old, well-worn, well-read Bible. It's open to 2 Chronicles 7:14 in the Old Testament. If my people turn from their wicked ways, I will heal their land. And Nell had written in the annotation right there next to that verse, a wonderful note, a wonderful verse for the healing of a nation, as she put it. And that's what he was pledging himself to, an era of national renewal for America and the world. They were going to change the world. Moscow's immediate reaction to this, we didn't see this because we didn't get stuff from the Soviet press like we do today with the internet and availability. But I went back and I read Pravda, TASS, and the other publications, all the different Soviet publications from January, February, and March 1981. Immediately, they were just apoplectic over the possibility of Ronald Reagan and John Paul II getting together. And this is an amazing statement to make about a pope who's a saint, of all things now. They refer to John Paul II as a malicious, lowly, perfidious, and backward toady of American militarists. This, by the way, that's kind of standard rhetoric in Soviet publications. It really is. Seeking to undermine communism with his overseas accomplices and his new boss in the White House. Ronald Reagan, John Paul II's new boss in the White House. So they're immediately fearful of this. Right? If only these guys could both be gone. And I quote Uncle Joe, Stalin here, right? Death solves all problems, right? No man, no problem. Kind of an operating credo in the Soviet system. March 30th, 1981, Ronald Reagan exiting the Washington Hilton Hotel. He went in to speak to an AFL-CIO audience at 2 o'clock that afternoon. John Hinckley got his copy of the Washington Star that morning. He was looking to get, he's not working for the Soviets. He's just trying to get the attention of actress Jodie Foster. I mean, no grandiose, great global ideological political ambitions here at all. And he had other people in mind that he might take a shot at. He looked in the Washington Star. He found out that Ronald Reagan was going to be right across the street. He said, wow, my luck, look at this. Walked outside, had a revolver that used 22 Devastator bullets, fired several shots. James Brady went down immediately, bleeding from the head. Kevin McCarthy, one of the Secret Service agents, turned himself into a human shield, jumped right in between the president and the shooter. Ronald Reagan was shoved into the back of the limo by Jerry Parr, the Secret Service agent, and he said, Jerry, get off, right? I think you've broken one of my ribs. And Jerry Parr propped him up and looked at him. There was frothy blood bubbles coming out of his lips. He said, you've been hit. That's a puncture wound. That's a lung wound. And he immediately ordered the driver to go straight to George Washington University Hospital. That snap decision probably saved Ronald Reagan's life. I mean, there are people that thought that he didn't even get hit. Frank Reynolds, ABC News, reported that he wasn't even hit. Mrs. Reagan didn't know what to expect when she got there, right? No idea what to expect. There's a lot of bad information. In fact, he was bleeding to death. He got out of the car and he thinks he's going to walk into George Washington University. He was seriously injured. Joke to the staff, right? I hope you're all Republicans. I hope you're all Republicans. This is fascinating. He wrote this in his diary. I focused on that tiled ceiling and I prayed. Wrote this in his memoirs, An American Life. And Mike and I were talking about this earlier, his sense of forgiveness. And this is coming, I think, from his grandmother as well. I focused on that tiled ceiling and prayed before he went out. But I realized I couldn't ask for God's help while I felt hatred for the mixed-up young man who shot me. An amazing, generous, charitable statement. I mean, you could be sitting there thinking, I mean, I got this plan to take down the communists. I've been an actor in Hollywood. This nut is trying to end it all. He's sitting there praying for the mixed-up young man who shot him. Isn't that the meaning of the lost sheep? We're all God's children. I began to pray for his soul that he would find his way back into the fold. His pastor at the time of the National Presbyterian Church, the Reverend Louis Evans, who I talked to after God and Ronald Reagan came out, he called me. I had never met him. He said, he read my book. He said, I have some things I want to tell you. And one of the things he told me, he said, I met with Ronald Reagan after this, and he told me that he had this powerful sense that if he didn't forgive his shooter at that moment, that God was going to take him. That forgiveness was that crucial, almost a condition for his survival. Of course, John Paul II would do the same thing, right? Forgive his shooter. He immediately told a bunch of different people that he believed he had been spared by God for a special purpose. He told Mike. He told Mike's sister, Maureen. Billy Graham, the Reverend Louis Evans. Cardinal Cook, he told Mother Teresa. Mother Teresa, it was a June 1981 lunch they had at the White House. Mother Teresa and another little nun and looked at Ronald Reagan and Nancy and said, "Do you know, Mr. President, we stayed up for 2 straight nights praying for you? We prayed very hard that you would survive." And Mrs. Reagan just dissolved into tears. She was so touched by it. Ronald Reagan was speechless. He wrote in his diary, "I owe my life to God and will try to serve him in every way that I can." Edmund Morris said that meant, among other things, defeating that institutional of all evils, Soviet communism. And on that, he's counting on a certain Polish pope in Rome to help out. If only he could survive. May 13th, 1981, just 6 weeks later. See, everybody remembers that these 2 guys were shot, right? How many remember that it was this close together? These were 6 weeks in world history where everything could have changed. I mean, that chunk of the Berlin Wall sitting out there right now wouldn't be sitting out there right now. Not at this library. I mean, not if these 2 guys had died 6 weeks apart, no way. Maybe communism would have eventually fallen, but not in 1989. May 13th, 1981, St. Peter's Square, Rome, 23-year-old Muslim Turk, Mehmet Ali Asha. This guy is working for a grandiose conspiracy, international conspiracy. He's later going to name 7 accomplices. He had been there all day, got there about 9 a.m., waited till 12 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock. He's holding a 9mm semi-automatic Browning that he's concealing. One of the guys in the crowd with him, Orel Chelik, who's on the other side of St. Peter's Square, is holding a panic bomb. And the moment Asha shoots, Chelik is going to detonate his panic bomb. So the crowd's attention will be diverted to the explosion from the panic bomb on the other side to allow Asha to get away. So he waits and waits. Finally, the Pope's white Fiat Pope Mobile comes around the corner. About 1/4 the hour, George Weigel says 5:13 p.m. So the time of day would have matched the time on the calendar, 5:13, 1981, May 13th, 1981. Past the ancient obelisk in the center of St. Peter's Square where Peter was martyred 1900 years earlier. Asha lifts his pistol in the air, squeezes the trigger, 4 shots are fired, 2 of them hit. One hit the Pope's hand and the other hit him in the abdomen. He immediately collapsed into the arms of Father Zivich, who's cradling him, holding him right there. Zivich asks, "Are you hit? Where?" "Yes, in the stomach." "Does it hurt?" "Yes, it hurts." The Pope was immediately rushed to Gemelli Hospital, one of Rome's best hospitals, where, just like Ronald Reagan, the best and the brightest happened to be there, happened to get there just in time, happened to be on staff. He's losing a lot of blood. Father Zivich said, 1 more traffic obstruction along the way, 1 wrong turn by the driver, he would have bled to death. Same kind of thing. Had to make the exact direct route to the hospital quickly enough, just like George Washington University, had to get there just in time or he would have bled to death. He's barely conscious when he gets to the hospital. His final words, Zivich, by the way, gave him the anointing, the last rites. And they thought he was going to die. They transfused 6 pints of blood into him. The first transfusion didn't take. The doctors on call had to donate their blood. Right before he passed out, he said to the nurse, "How could they do it?" Which is an amazing statement. Ronald Reagan knew right away that it was a mixed up young man, that it was a single shooter. And John Paul II, there's only one person shooting at him from 20 feet away. But he tells the nurse, "How could they do it? How could they do it?" So apparently he had a hunch. This was more than one shooter. Cruciati, the doctor, Francesco Cruciati, got there. He said amazingly he went in, and usually the place is completely packed. You can't get an elevator. He walked in. Every single elevator door was open, waiting for him. So he said some unknown genius had opened all the elevator doors for him. Went straight up to the 9th floor, Gemelli Clinic, looked at his patient. Blood pressure dropped to 70. 5.5 hours of surgery. And this is a guy like Ronald Reagan, great physical health. Outdoorsman, right? These guys were in great physical shape, late into their lives. 6 pints of blood he needed. Reagan had needed 8. Each of them, the bullet goes in either direction by a few centimeters. They're dead men. They wouldn't have survived. They would have bled to death. Asha failed to get away, because he was stopped by a nun. And a nun by the name of Sister Letizia from the Bergamo region. That's not her, but I found a picture of a nun on the internet. I like to think that's what she looked like. So I know a lot of you went to Catholic school. You're like, oh yeah, that's her, right? That's who pinned him down. That's who grabbed him. But she grabbed him. She said, why did you do it? And he said, not me, not me. She said, yes, you did it. You can just picture this, right? Any of you went to Catholic school? And she held him down. She didn't realize it. He didn't realize it, but she was saving his life. Because the moment that he was going to get back into the truck, which was concealed as like a Bulgarian goods company, his communist friends were going to execute him. They were going to shoot him. They were going to kill him. I mean, they were going to give him a check, a suitcase full of $300,000 and send him off to Aruba, right, to retire in the sun. That's not the way they did things. After one of the talks, a gentleman said to me, just like the mafia. I said, don't insult the mafia by comparing them to the communists. I mean, that's not fair. Right? It's not fair. So the nun saved his life. May 13th, 1981, for those of you who are Catholic, this was the feast day of Our Lady of Fatima. And this is a big part of this book, of the narrative of this story. You can't understand the way John Paul II saw all of this without knowing it. So whether you're Catholic or not, as they say in the book, you need to understand this to understand how John Paul II thought about it. And here's the really interesting thing. Ronald Reagan knew about this stuff too. He knew what Our Lady of Fatima was. He knew, that there was a first secret, a second secret, a third secret. But according to Catholics, and this is an apparition of Mary, one of the very few, maybe a half dozen to a dozen, that have been authenticated by Rome out of thousands of claimed apparitions over the centuries. But she allegedly appeared to 3 shepherd children. First day, May 13th, 1917. Several times between May 13th and October 13th, the last of these was the miracle of the sun, which was allegedly witnessed by a crowd of 70,000. And she issued 3 predictions to these little shepherd children, that one world war would end, the first one would end soon, and the second would start, a second would follow soon after that. I mean, the second one came to 20-some years after that. Predicted the rise of communism in Bolshevik Russia, said the communists in Bolshevik Russia would spread their errors and persecutions. I think it makes it more believable that these are kids, because how could a kid make that up, right? I mean, the communists took over Bolshevik Russia after October 3rd. It was October 25th, 26th, 1917 that they took over. And the third secret, which was sealed in a vault in the Vatican, predicted, and John Paul II didn't know this at the time, he hadn't read it yet, but an attack on the bishop in white. There's only one bishop that wears white in the Catholic Church, and who's that? The Pope. Under a volley of gunfire, and he would die in the process. That wasn't known yet by John Paul II. Only a few other popes had read it. Father Zivich said he started immediately reflecting on this extraordinary coincidence, 2/13 of May. May 13th, 1917, May 13th, 1981. And with that, he said, I want to read the third secret. So Cardinal Sepper brought it to him in Gemelli Clinic in Rome, where he was recovering, brought him a Portuguese text, the original, an Italian translation. One of them is white, one of them was yellow. He read this, read the document, looked at this, and he said, that's it. The third secret of Fatima applied to me. It was supposed to be me. I was supposed to die. And I was spared. I was saved. I was spared for a special purpose. I was the bishop in white. This was John Paul II, the totus tuus Pope, totally yours. Very Marian Pope, very strong kind of Marian theology. Ronald Reagan long knew about Fatima. When Reagan was head of the Screen Actors Guild, there was the major film on Fatima was done at that point in time. He'd have known about it at least from that. Would have also known about it from his brother, who was a very devout Catholic, from his father, who was Catholic, Jack Reagan. Jane Wyman had converted to the Catholic faith, right? Feast Day of the Immaculate Conception with you and Marine. 1954. I asked Tony Dolan, who was Ronald Reagan's chief speechwriter. wrote the Notre Dame speech, which I'll mention in a minute, some others, and he tried to give Ronald Reagan a number of different things on Fatima. And Dolan said to me, he said, well, you know about the Portugal speech, right? No, what Portugal speech? He said, you don't know about the Portugal speech? I said, no. He said he mentioned Fatima, the president did, in a speech in Portugal in May 1985. I thought, I can't believe I've never done this. So I opened up the public papers of the presidents where you type in the keyword. And why didn't I never think of it? I typed in the word Fatima, and it popped up. I almost fell out of my chair. Ronald Reagan to the government of Portugal, prime minister there, the assembly, everybody, the entire group there. And he said, mentioned Mary, the children of Fatima, the shrine, all of that stuff. John Paul II going there a year after he was shot, May 1982, where he took the bullet from his body and put it in the crown of Our Lady of Fatima. Reagan said, the prayers of the children of Fatima, in those there resides more power than in all the great armies and statesmen of the world. That's an amazing statement, especially for a non-Catholic president to make. So this was central to the story. The White House reaction to the Pope, the shooting of the Pope, Reagan was mortified, immediately sent best wishes off to Rome. In his diary, all that he wrote that night, word brought to us of the shooting of the Pope, called Cardinal Cook and Cardinal Kroll of New York and Philadelphia, sent message to Vatican and prayed. And prayed. Six weeks earlier, he sent off a cable. I just received the news of the shocking attack on you. All right, our prayers are with you. The two had, and John Paul II, after Ronald Reagan was shot, had immediately sent the same kind of wishes to him. I'm praying for you, I'm praying for you. So now they have the world's most exclusive prayer society, the two of them. Dick Allen said, President asked me every day for weeks thereafter about the Pontiff's recovery. The president's affection for the Pope was greatly magnified by the shooting. So if Moscow was worried about an alliance between these two, it just backfired. 5 days later, President had a birthday wish taken by Congressman Peter Rodino, Democrat from New York, to Carol Wojtyła. I've seen the documentary. It's a beautiful glossy print, letterhead. And look at this statement. I find this really remarkable. Here's what President Reagan is saying to John Paul II. Happily, few leaders in the world today have the dubious distinction of knowing with some precision the kind of event that you have just experienced, right? There's a bond over this. I mean, it could have all ended here if they would have both died. Now this has changed everything. All right, May 17, 1981, Ronald Reagan's first public speech after the shooting of John Paul II. I mean, come on, Notre Dame. If you were doing a movie on this, you wouldn't even put this in the, I mean, people wouldn't believe it, right? You can't have him speak at Notre Dame. I mean, come on. You know, Notre Dame in French means what? Our Lady, right? I mean, it's America's premier Catholic college. And he's given the commencement speech. It's not like he said, you know, the Pope was shot. Let's see if I could speak at Notre Dame, you know, this weekend. Right? This has been planned weeks, months in advance. Goes there, and he noted the Pope's previous year encyclical on mercy, where the Pope had warned of certain economic theories that use the rhetoric of class struggle to justify injustice, where the neighbor is sometimes destroyed, killed. I think this is Reagan's first kind of possible indication that he thinks that maybe Moscow might have been involved. That's speculation on my part. I don't know when exactly he first thought that, but I think there's something being said there. Bill Casey, the Irish Catholic who ran the CIA, really thought Moscow was up to something. And the next day, May 14th, very next morning, calls together the National Foreign Intelligence Board in Washington on F Street to find out what the Soviets are up to. Moscow's reaction to this, TASS issued a very terse two-sentence statement, suddenly very quiet after squawking and complaining about a Pope-Reagan alliance, right? This backward toady and everything. According to the Vatican spokesman, John Paul II remains in stable condition. The Pope was hit by 3 of the 4 bullets that the terrorists fired, which is inaccurate. He was hit by 2 of the 4. So Moscow was a little overly hopeful, right? Maybe the plan here was to get 3 out of 4. Maybe someone needed to alert him. No, comrade, only 2. Only 2 were hit. On May 15th came their first published response. You should read it. I quoted at length in the book. The terrorist who yesterday tried to kill John Paul II is a Turkish citizen with ties to Turkey's neo-fascist party. Turk, all through this. Right? They're betraying their guilt. When I read this stuff, I thought, they did it. This is, I could just see right through it. The first newspaper to accuse Moscow was The Guardian in Britain, the left-wing publication, September 1981, to suggest that Moscow might have been involved. And with that, Izvestia went wild, Pravda went wild, and finally Moscow started fulminating and lashing out. They wrote this in an editorial in Izvestia. On May 13th, it will be recalled, there was an assassination attempt against the Pope. The Turk, Mahmoud Ali Asha, is a fascist. Naturally, it never occurred to anyone to portray this piece of scum as a communist agent. Again, standard rhetoric. Ali Asha Shah was said to be the result of a plot organized by the countries of the Eastern Bloc. Ridiculous. Called it a vile concoction. Very soon, Moscow would be launching disinformation saying that the CIA was behind the shooting of the Pope. Why would they want to do that, right? Finally, Ronald Reagan and John Paul II get together June 7, 1982 at the Vatican. I need to move a little bit faster here, but they had wanted to get together so many times. Well, Reagan wanted to get together with him back in June 1979, when the 9 days in Poland, when he watched footage. They finally got together and they said to one another, Bill Clark, who was there, said that Ronald Reagan said to John Paul II, they meet one-on-one in the Vatican Library for 50 minutes. Pope spoke like 7 different languages, including English, able to speak in English. Reagan said, look how the evil forces were put in our way and how Providence intervened. They confided to one another that they believed that God had spared their lives for a special purpose. And that special purpose was to take down and defeat atheistic, murderous Soviet communism. The time had come. And they, working together, could do it. A cardinal said, this is a powerful quote. Think about this. People in this room are old enough to know, isn't this true, right? Nobody believed the collapse of communism would happen this fast or in this timetable. But in their first meeting, the Holy Father and President committed themselves and the institutions of America and the Church, the White House and the Vatican, to just that goal. And from that day, the focus was to bring it about. Poland would be the dagger to the heart of the Soviet communist bloc. And imagine a non-Polish president, a non-Catholic president, saying to the Polish Pope, hope remains in Poland, in your country, right? Working together, we can keep it alive. So that was the plan. They would meet together one-on-one 5 times. June 1982 at the Vatican, Fairbanks, Alaska, May 1984, Miami, September 1987, the Vatican again, June 87, Castel Gandolfo, September 1990. Were you at Castel Gandolfo? Joanne was at Castel Gandolfo for that one. Nancy had enormous respect for John Paul II. And Ronald Reagan, too. I have enormous respect and affection. Nancy reviewing photos. I think she was reviewing them with you or Kirby. And she saw a photo of John Paul II. She said, oh, my favorite, right? My favorite. She loved him. And she pointed to a lot of qualities, character traits that she felt John Paul II shared with her husband, right? Both outdoorsmen, athletic, charming, kind, gentle, sincere. They were in very, very frequent communication, so much so that I tried to count it and I couldn't. I couldn't count the number of cables, the number of letters, the number of telegrams, memoranda. There's so many. Martin and Annalise Anderson said that by the end of 1981, a dozen or so letters had already been exchanged between the two of them. That's 1981. Remember, they didn't meet yet until June 7, 1982. They were already talking that frequently. The Vatican documents, these are still among the most redacted documents here at the Reagan Library. See that page? The entire page, redacted, blacked out, all the way across. The Vatican documents in their end are sealed for 75 years. If you want a transcript of what Reagan and John Paul II were saying June 7th, 1982, you got to wait till June 7th, 2057 to get it. I'll be 90 if I make it that long. Constant. James Nance, Dennis Blair, Bill Clark, they were worried that they had too much communication going on. Clark said, no, let's keep talking as much as possible. So we seem to be overloading Vatican circuits lately. We're talking so much. No, keep it going, keep it going. Frank Shakespeare, the second ambassador to the Vatican. Ronald Reagan, John Paul II felt the need to counsel very frequently. As the head of the world's leading spiritual power and the world's leading temporal power, they felt the need for one another's counsel. Here's a document that I've got here at the Reagan Library. This is amazing. Look at this. I don't know if you can read this, but it's still classified. I have no idea what they're saying in it. Charge was called to the Vatican at 23:40 hours local time, February 7th, to receive a personal message for transmission from Pope John Paul II to President Reagan. The Pope had tried unsuccessfully to reach the president by phone this afternoon. And when he was unable to get through, he asked that this message be delivered. This is almost midnight. And then it says, I'm all excited to read this document. I get to page 2, begin text of Pope's message. Mr. Ronald Reagan, President of the United States of America, zip, blank, whole page. Next page, blank. February 7th, 1984, end text of Pope's message. Now, what does it say? I have no idea. What was so urgent? February 19th, I have no idea. Cappuccino diplomacy. The real conduit between the White House and the Vatican was these three. Bill Casey at the CIA, Bill Clark at the National Security Council, and Cardinal Pio Laghi, who was the apostolic nuncio to Washington. Clark and Casey, when they would talk on the phone, and they were always worried that the phones might be bugged. And so when they felt the need that they needed to talk to Laghi, Clark would say to Casey or vice versa, I think it's time for some cappuccino. Because Laghi made the best cappuccino in Washington. You couldn't get cappuccino at a Starbucks in every corner of Washington in those days. So they would go there. Clark told me we would meet one way or another every week. And Laghi also met with the president at least 6 times at the White House, and even flew all the way to the Reagan Ranch to meet with him on one occasion. Sharing intelligence, Casey would fly to Rome in a windowless C-41 black jet, giving the Pope the best satellite reconnaissance available anywhere in the world, showing him Polish troop movements, communist troop movements in Poland, Czech missile sites, I mean, everything. Pope was amazed by this technology. All right, this is kind of moving along more quickly because I'm watching the clock. I got to wrap it up so I can take some of your questions. The blockbuster thing that I report in the book deals with the shooting of John Paul II. And what I learned, the first time I learned it was from Bill Clark at his ranch one July day in 2005. I was Clark's biographer, and we talked every day for years. And one day we were sitting in his living room, and I asked him, I said, Bill, I don't think I ever asked you what you and Reagan thought about the shooting of the Pope. And he said, oh, well, yeah, Paul. And then he started to talk. I was so transfixed, I didn't even hit the record button on the recorder. But he told me that from the very beginning, he and Reagan and Casey thought that the Soviets were behind it, or at least strongly suspected that the Soviets were behind it. That, and then I was told by, this is the thing that I break that's really completely new. I was told that under Casey's leadership at the CIA, because the institutional CIA was really bad on this issue, they thought there's no way that the Soviets would kill a pope. I mean, they're not that bad. I mean, shoot the Pope, kill the Pope. But Casey thought, oh yeah, they would kill a Pope. So Casey had a very tight-knit group under his command. I was told it was a report done by 2 women, one in her late 20s, early 30s. They know who they are. Another one in her early 40s, and it's about 30 pages in length. One of the persons who saw it said this was the most classified thing I've ever seen. I don't know where the document is. I understand from Owen Smith, Casey's son-in-law, that it's still at Langley, and they're trying to get it declassified. But this was, as he put it, the most classified thing I've ever read. And they found out, their deduction in the report was that the Soviets did, in fact, order the hit on the Pope. And who ordered it? Who did it? The Soviet GRU, military intelligence. They ordered the hit on the Pope. And they did it. They did it with the go-ahead and the approval of Yuri Andropov at the KGB. By the way, who worked at the KGB at the time? Vladimir Putin. Now, to be sure, it was very important. There's no way Putin would have known about this. He was too low level. I think probably Andropov was the only person, all of the KGB, that knew it. This was the tightest, most secretive thing the Soviets ever did. Casey briefed Reagan on it, and I was told how the conversation went. Casey told him, and Ronald Reagan said, well, can I see that? And he said, yeah, you can see it. Take a look at it. My deductions, I think the briefing took place May 16th, 1985, 11:02 to 11:17 a.m. Process of elimination. It's had to be the date that it happened. I don't know for sure. Of all of the documents cleared for classification in Doug Brinkley's edited Reagan diaries, this is one of only a handful of pages that wasn't cleared that date. John Paul II, Casey told John Paul II about the findings. John Paul II's reaction was, I know. I figured that they did it. Yeah, God told me that they the Fatima. I read about it July 18th, 1981. I know they did it. But he figured all along that they did it. And his point was, let's not launch World War III over this. And what happened has happened. And he also figured that if he accused them publicly of it, they would publicly deny it. They would launch a campaign of disinformation. Some people would believe it. He said, people think they did it anyway. Let's just leave it there. Thomas Melody, who was President Bush's ambassador to the Vatican, said that at that point in 1989, too, they were trying, he had good relations with Gorbachev. The world was changing. He said, let it go. Let it go. All right. 1989, the collapse of communism. Ronald Reagan at his Century City office in California was visited by 3 members of the Polish Solidarity Movement and Chris Zawodkowski of the Polish Solidarity Movement, United States, Polish-American. And they came to him for some advice before Poland was about to hold the first free and fair elections in the communist bloc, which should have happened at Yalta. If Ronald Reagan was in this room right now, he'd say, that was at Yalta that they were supposed to have free and fair elections. February 1945, finally, the spring of 1989, they're talking free and fair elections. And they asked the old campaigner, he's no longer president at that point, they said, could you give us some advice? And Reagan said, yes, listen to your conscience, because that's where the Holy Spirit speaks to you. Which is an odd thing to say, is kind of campaign. A very John Paul II type statement. And then he told me, Chris Zawodkowski told me, he did an amazing thing. He pointed to a picture of John Paul II, and he said, he's my best friend. And I think what he means by that is not that he was actually his best friend, right? Where they call each other to talk about going fishing or talk about the kids. But in this battle to take down, this battle of the century, of the 20th century, to defeat Soviet communism, he knew that he had no better friend than John Paul II. I think that's what he meant by it. November 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. But it was only after elections in Poland. Mikhail Gorbachev said, when they held elections in Poland in June 1989, I knew it was all over. The communists lost 100 out of 100 seats. That's why they don't hold elections in North Korea. That's why they don't hold elections in Cuba. All right? Because they lose. If they thought they could win the election, they would hold it. The Vatican, September 1990, this was their final meeting together. They met at Castel Gandolfo. No one reported anything on this. USA Today did a 3-sentence blurb. 30-minute meeting, ended with Pope saying, God bless America. Mrs. Reagan, through Joanne got this statement from Mrs. Reagan for me. She said that she remembered it as a warm and wonderful meeting. I asked, did they talk about the collapse of communism? Yeah, they talked about all those things. Said, I can't really recall any specifics, but It was just a warm, wonderful meeting. We loved this Pope. We really got along with him. So if only they would have known that that was the last time that they would see each other. All right, wrapping up. New century, John Paul II is ailing from Parkinson's disease. Ronald Reagan, of course, from Alzheimer's. Think of the irony. Ronald Reagan, right, the body is strong, but the mind is going. Carol Wojtyła, John Paul II, right, the mind is strong, but the body is going. Bill Clark would die of Parkinson's. And Bill Clark used to tell me, you know, Paul, the good Lord gave Parkinson's to saints like my father and John Paul II. Now he's gotten around to giving it to sinners like myself. That's what Clark said. June 4th, 2004. So the Holy Father would ask, George Weigel said he would ask me about President Reagan. How's he doing? He thought it was really sad to hear that he couldn't remember being president, couldn't remember anything from his past. June 4th, 2004, President George W. Bush flew to Rome to give the Presidential Medal of Freedom to John Paul II. John Paul II responded by thanking Bush and thanking President Reagan and sending his prayers to President Reagan. The next day, President Reagan died, June 5th, 2004. The Pope issued a statement hailing Ronald Reagan's contributions. Less than a year later, April 2nd, 2005, John Paul II passed away. Last thing here, June 27, 2011, I think this is a poignant way to kind of end it. St. Mary's Basilica in Krakow, they held a special Thanksgiving Mass for Blessed John Paul II. He had just been beatified by the church. And for the life of President Reagan, it was the centenary of his birth. And you all were there, right? And officiating at this service was Cardinal Živec, that priest who had held a dying, sagging pope in his arms on the feast day of Our Lady of Fatima, May 13th, 1981. And he said this world is a battlefield of good and evil, of truth and falsehood. Each of us faces a choice on that battlefield. Today we recall two great men who stood before this very choice, and their decision on what to do about that influenced the course of history and shaped the world in which we live. So these two guys answered the call. They chose the side of good on that battlefield against evil, and with that, they rewrote the story of the ending of the 20th century. Thank you. I went a little long. Sorry about that.
Fascinating. He has agreed to take questions, but if you have a question, we ask that you raise your hand. We have a microphone, and we need you to be on the microphone for the question as we are live streaming. So, over here. Here we have one right here.
My parents are Lithuanian refugees, and my dad reads everything, and he said your book was the best Father's Day present he's ever gotten.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it. That is a great compliment. I mean, coming from somebody who was actually lived the evil empire. I mean, Lithuania was one of those three Baltic states that the communists just crushed. And Ronald Reagan's affection for the people of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, the communists said, only a matter of time before Ronald Reagan starts speaking Polish, they said. They made fun of him for that. But thank you. Go ahead.
My question was just, what did your research show the Pope and the President doing to support the Baltic states? Because we know that they were doing it. I know that there was a secret meeting with one of the Scientist Freedom Movement members with the Pope at the Vatican. And certainly President Reagan and his administration were behind.
Yes, so much. In fact, when you get the book, look in the index just under those different country names. But John Paul II immediately started appointing cardinals and bishops from those areas who were really staunch, outspoken anti-communists, and that just infuriated Moscow. I mean, that made them even angrier. They were hoping that he would be an accommodationist, but instead he comes in, he takes people that were in prison for 30 years that were tortured by the communists and says, take that, you're the new bishop. And in one case, one of the Eastern Bloc bishops who had been sort of an accommodationist under Pope John Paul VI, or Pope Paul VI, Carol Wojtyla was very bothered by what an accommodationist he was, and he said, "You tell him that I will visit his country when he learns to bang his fist on the table." So in other words, when he learns to look at the communists and say, "No, you tell me that? No, I'm not going to do that." So here again, it's a story of courage. These two men, both of them, who in a very winsome way, in a way that everybody liked them, were fearless in saying what really needed to be said. Right? Ronald Reagan constantly reinserting, tear down this wall, back into whatever speech he was giving. And then he would deliver it. He'd deliver with a smile. But no one was going to tell them that they couldn't speak out against evil. I mean, here are two men that the idea that the Soviets would shoot a pope, those two said, "Oh, yeah." Ronald Reagan and John Paul II, yeah, the Soviets would shoot a pope. You bet they would. I mean, they would have taken Pius XII. Stalin would have fitted a noose and hung him from the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel if he could have. Could have gotten his hands around him. Yeah, they would shoot a pope.
I think Mike has a question.
Yeah, thank you for coming.
So thank you for coming. Thank you.
It's great to have you here because I've read all your books and talked to you so much on them. I just got back from Fatima. But interesting, as you connect dots here, I was thinking of something. I had a conversation with Lady Thatcher the morning after we buried my father. We happened to be staying at the same hotel over in Bel Air.
Wow.
And she came up to me afterwards and she said, or that morning, she said, "Think what we could have accomplished had your dad been elected in 1976. And I said to Lady Thatcher, Lady Thatcher, had he been elected, the Berlin Wall would still be up. And she said, "Why do you say that?" I said, "Where were you in 76? Where was Lech Walesa in 76?
Right.
Where was Pope John Paul in 76?
Yeah. None of them are in yet.
None of you were in place in 76. And if you want to know how God worked in this,
Right.
he had to be elected in 1980
Right.
to make it all work.
Yes. Yeah.
Because 1976, nobody else was there
Right.
for him to work with as they were there in 1980 and through and ultimately Mikhail Gorbachev in 1985.
Yeah, think about that. If your dad would have won 2 terms, in 76 and 80, he would have been out in 84, right? And Gorbachev would have come into office May of 85, a few months after. Actually, I would argue he wouldn't have come into office because of with the way that events turned out. And your sister Maureen used to say that when your dad lost the 76 presidential bid, that she went up to him and she cried for weeks. And he said, "Are you still crying?" And she said, "Yeah, Dad, it's all over. They say that you'll be too old in 1980. You can't run again." And he said, "God has a plan. God has," and this is something he learned from his mother, the DP. Him and Bill Clark called it the DP, the Divine Plan. They had an acronym for it. Clark had an acronym for everything. So they called it the DP, the Divine Plan. But he said, God has a plan. And I've never met any figure in all of presidential history with this strong sense of providence who, and he learned this from his mom, anything bad that happens, it happens for a good reason if you're faithful and good will come from it. So looking back, he being shot, him and John Paul II being shot, it strengthened the bond. I have a chapter in the book where somebody told me this, and I checked it out. I spent a whole summer here just researching this one point. This guy told me that the Soviets were ready to invade Poland on March 30th, 1981. He was working at a field station in Berlin. And he said, "You know what stopped it that day?" He said, "Think about the date." He said, "Ronald Reagan was shot March 30th, 1981. He said, "Yeah, that's what stopped the invasion." And I didn't believe it at first, but the story is highly, highly plausible. And the idea, and Ronald Reagan went to his grave never knowing this, but the possibility that maybe him taking a bullet might have stopped the Soviets from invading Poland and launching World War III, how would that be for divine providence? And I could just see Ronald Reagan just kind of shrugging his shoulders and smiling and saying, "Well, there you go." Right? In just a kind of nonchalant way, right? Yeah, okay, all right, thank you.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question, and it's back here. And then Paul will be in the bookstore in just a few minutes. So anybody that has a question for him, please save it, and you can talk to him directly in the bookstore. So right back here.
Yes, thank you. Another encouragement in your book is to pray for our leaders, I think, too.
Thank you.
And as someone who was born in Pittsburgh and lived most of my life in Oxnard.
Nice.
It's a blessing to see a Pittsburgh area
You got it.
prof
Thank
dedicating to an Oxnard-born public servant like Bill Clark. I'd heard, and maybe it was on one of the panels there that you showed, that once CIA chief, the CIA chief showed those pictures to the Pope, that wasn't he able to detail some things out back to the CIA chief, like, oh, I know that area, you know, in the woods. Or
Oh,
whatever.
sure. Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And think about the technology in the 1980s. It's just so dated, right? Today you can get a satellite photo from Google just off your phone. But at that point in time, to the Pope, this was unbelievable technology. And he would look at these pictures just in amazement. Herb Meyer, who was Bill Casey's right-hand man, told me about walking into Casey's office one day, and there was a giant, in front of his desk, a giant photo of a sea of humanity and a tiny little speck of white in the middle of it. And Herb said to Casey, "What's that?" And Casey went, "Oh, yeah." He said, "This is an amazing picture. This is the Pope's visit to Poland in June 1979. This huge sea of people and that little white speck is him." He said, "It's his birthday next week. I figured it'd be a great birthday gift for him." And Herb asked him later, he said, "How'd the Pope like your gift?" He said, "Normally you bring him a bottle of wine or a box of chocolates. You're taking him a satellite photo." And Casey said, "Oh, he loved it. Thought it was great, loved it." So to sit there and have the CIA director sharing with him this kind of intelligence, he was blown away by it. He was very impressed. So that's just one example of the sort of nitty-gritty. How did they cooperate? Well, I mean, they were able to show him, here's troop movements, here are these people, here's where their missiles are located, all right there in front of him. That was stuff that he certainly couldn't have gotten in Poland. The Pope couldn't have gotten in Poland.
Thank you. I
All
feel
right.
like we've been through a master class
Thank
this
you.
evening.
Oh, thank you.
So if you
Appreciate
will
it.
all bear with us and let Paul go ahead and get settled in the bookstore, and then we'll have you start to come in over through this door, get your book if you don't have one.